The smoke of Satan.
Hello, my name is Joseph Silva Jr. and welcome to The Smoke of Satan. We're talking about the Papal Encyclical Pascendi Dominici Gregis, and this is part 4, which is The Modernist As Believer. Again, I'm a writer of edgy Catholic fiction. I've written a book called When the Wood is Dry, an edgy Catholic thriller. My graphic novel and comic book, Blind Prophet, and my novel for Christmas, which is Merry Freaking Christmas, an edgy Christmas comedy which comes in a naughty edition and a standard edition. The standard edition has less bad language in it. Has some, because it's kind of a PG-13. It's not for kids, okay? And this, When the Wood is Dry, does come in a Catholic edition, which has some extra features for Catholic readers that they might find interesting, and it also has less bad language, actually a lot less. There's almost no bad language in the Catholic edition of that book, unless you speak Spanish. Okay, anyway, let's get going with part 4, The Modernist as Believer. And again, the smoke of Satan comes from this quote from Pope St. Paul VI, where he said, "We would say that through some mysterious crack, no, it's not mysterious, through some crack, the smoke of Satan has entered the Church of God. There is doubt, uncertainty, problems, unrest, dissatisfaction, confrontation." Now, he said that back in the 70s, early 70s, I think, probably. So, after Vatican II, after the new Mass, he's talking about the smoke of Satan. I think that smoke of Satan was what we let in when we opened up the windows of the church in Vatican II, and it's been plaguing us. This was a battle that's been raging in the church for a couple of centuries, and in 1960 they kind of surrendered to it in this that Second Vatican Council, and a lot of the theologians who had been censured by the church as heretics because of the Modernist Heresy, what they call the Modernist Heresy, actually had a lot of influence at the council and steered the church in a new direction, which I think accounts for a lot of our problems because it's heretical and it's undermining the basis of faith in the church. Okay, so let's get going. This is part 4, The Modernist as Believer. Again, I want to remind you of what we're supposed to believe via traditional theology, what St. Thomas Aquinas came up with, and what's been undermined. This is the basic problem with modernism. So, the true faith, we believe that there's 2 sources of knowledge. We have our senses and reason, which ends in knowledge, and we have a natural end, which is our death. This is the Greeks figured this out and did a pretty good job of it, and actually predicted that if this is true, there should be one God. They reasoned from the evidence and their senses and the reason that there should be one God. And that God should reveal himself. Now, he didn't reveal himself to the Greeks. He revealed himself to the Jews, and then fully revealed himself as God through Jesus Christ coming to earth, entering his own creation, suffering and dying for our sins. That revelation directly from God. Okay? And we also have a supernatural end in which we will be judged. So we have an eternal life and a supernatural end. But there's 2 sources of knowledge. Now, the modernists, what they called Nouvelle Theologie, which developed a couple hundred years ago, they believed in this idea of ressourcement. So they would go back and skip St. Thomas Aquinas and what he had developed and kind of rethink everything from a more modern, philosophical, agnostic perspective. Now, in this perspective, there is no direct revelation from God. Okay? The religious sentiment originates inside of the heart of man, and then he elaborates this for a while, and he comes up with rules, and if people believe in the rules for long enough, those rules, quote-unquote, live, and if they live, therefore they are true. This is heresy. You can't believe this and be a Catholic. In fact, you have to be able to believe that you can reason that there's one God, right? That's one of those dogmas of the faith that you have to believe or you're anathematized. There's a lot of anathemas we discussed in the previous episodes. Today we're going to discuss how condescending these philosophers are when they look at the believer. And we are the believers, right? St. Thomas was a believer. and they think, he's got it wrong because he didn't understand where his revelation was actually coming from, or the revelations of God were coming from. Okay, so here's our little diagram for how the modernists view the believer. Now we start here on the believer and we go around this clockwise. Okay, so the believer, he has some revelation of faith that originates in himself. Now, to be fair, the modernists might say that God puts that revelation into himself, but it originates in his own heart. It does not originate as an external revelation of God. Now, some of the modernists might argue about that, right? So there's disputes within the modernist camp about exactly how this works, okay? But the believer will perceive this as being God, as an external revelation from God. So you put yourself in the position of St. Thomas, He believes he's getting something directly from God. No, really, it's originated in St. Thomas. Sorry, it's in yourself. Okay? And you're just coming to believe that. And you will come to believe that so much that you will dismiss other aspects of science and history. And you'll believe it more than that because it's so powerful when you believe this. But really, it's just because there's something you didn't know and you wanted to figure it out because you needed to fill in the blank, so you came up with this reason. This is heretical. You can't believe it. It's condescending, and it's kind of a Gnostic heresy where the philosopher puts himself in the position of knowing more than everybody else because he knows that it didn't really originate as an external revelation of God. Okay, so let's examine a couple of points from the document about the problem with this. One of the problems is it makes every other religion the same. Because every pagan religion has the same thing going on. There's some believer believing something and iterating it in his mind, and then he iterates it long enough, he perceives it as coming from a God, or maybe more than one God, and then says, well, therefore it lives because more than one generation has believed in this nonsense, so therefore it's true. So all these religions are on the same plane. See, this isn't what we believe as Christians. We believe that the revelation did indeed come from God. Jesus came from God. Jesus is God, came to earth himself, entered his own creation, and showed us how to live, and sacrificed his life for ours, opening the gates of heaven to us. That is a reality. It's not something we iterated in our minds until we believed it. Okay? So, listen. Here's a couple quotes from the document. Given this doctrine of experience united with the other doctrine of symbolism, every religion, even that of paganism, must be held to be true. Here's another quote. In the conflict between different religions, the most that modernists can maintain is that the Catholic religion has more truth because it is more living, and that it deserves with more reason the name of Christian because it corresponds more fully with the origins of Christianity. So you see the problem here. They're saying that you really don't have a basis for truth except for consistency. If it's consistent with what, the origins of Christianity, then it's more true. Well, no. We believe in, Jesus said of himself that I am the way, the truth, and the life. So we believe in this external truth that comes from God. Okay. So, let's talk about where the modernists think tradition comes from. Since everything is based on experience like this, tradition becomes a communication of an experience from the past. Okay? So this experience from the past stimulates and refreshes this religious sentiment which is internal to the person. Again, as Catholics, we believe in divine revelation. We believe that what's being communicated through tradition is the truth that came from God, not something that came from some internal sensation that somebody wanted to figure out and passed on, and his experience is being communicated. That's not what we believe. All right? Sometimes the communication of religious experience takes root, and sometimes it doesn't. And when it does, it lives. And if it lives, it's true. So the idea that this thing lives because it's being passed on means that it's true. And this also applies to all the religions. So all the religions are like this, and all of them are true. That's a problem. But that's not the only problem. Another problem is that this makes people believe that they can have some kind of religious sentiment, iterated, elaborated, or whatever, and have it become true because it, quote-unquote, lives. And so that has implications for what these people think they can do to change what we believe, because it's in flux now. We can elaborate more religious ideas until we come up with something new. Okay. My contention is this is how you get a pope worshiping an idol in St. Peter's, which Pope Francis has done, because he thinks all religions reflect the internal grace of God. The problem is, what happens to the first commandment? Our religion says there's one God, and we need to love him above all things. Not this, well, there's one God, but maybe you see him in all these pagan religions or something. That's not what we believe. And we have many martyrs who have died for the faith and died for the reason that there is one God, and trying to teach people that. And it's these very pagans who killed them. Okay? And eventually they were, by their example that of their martyrdom, they converted those pagans to the faith. Okay. So, faith and science, we need to talk about this. All right? So this is how the modernists believe this works. Okay? You have science and religion, and we try to figure out things from our senses and reason, and we reach a point where we can't figure everything out. So there's something that's unknowable. Then this unknowable thing inspires in us a need for faith, because we've got to fill in those gaps, right? But it makes us uncomfortable. So that's where we get this faith and revelation, because they fill in the gaps. But faith and revelation is only in this realm of the unknowable. So there can't be a conflict with science. But the believer will believe these things came from God. All right? So if you believe it came from God, you will alter your vision of what science and history say. And that is in this process of disfigurement and disfiguration. So we find that faith is a corrupting influence on science and history. And so therefore we must go back and tease out the parts of science and history that have been corrupted by faith, and so we can get to our vision of a quote-unquote historical Jesus versus the one that we believe by faith. And because they allow this kind of double think in their thinking, where you can, in one realm, in science and history, you might think one thing, but in the realm of faith, you might think of another. They allow this kind of thing. But the believer himself might have a problem with it. And when he does, then you have to defer to science and history. Okay. So, All right. So the next, let's give you another quote from the document, okay, which will make this more concrete. Hence, should it be further asked whether Christ has wrought real miracles and made real prophecies, whether he rose truly from the dead and ascended into heaven, the answer of agnostic science will be in the negative, and the answer of faith in the affirmative. Yet there will not be, on that account, any conflict between them. For it will be denied by the philosopher as philosopher, speaking to philosophers, and considering Christ only in his historical reality, and it will be affirmed by the speaker, speaking to believers, and considering the life of Christ as lived, again, by the faith and in the faith. So, it's true in the faith, but it's not true when you're talking to other philosophers. Again, it puts the philosopher in this mastermind position where he understands the believer, well, we understand that he kind of believes this stuff is true, but it isn't really true. Okay? And that's okay, because I'm talking with philosophers now who are in on the game. But if I'm talking to believers, I gotta kind of respect their beliefs and their, quote unquote, I would say, my quote, delusion, okay, of faith. This is heretical. This is wrong. This is why you end up with some of these theologians from Vatican II going completely off the rails, and like Karl Rahner. They're not Catholics anymore. Okay? Now, Pope Pius X points out that this thinking leads to a primacy of science. It makes faith subject to science and he points out 3 grounds. Okay? So, divine reality and experience are removed to faith. The rest is subject to science. And this happens whether you like it or not. So here's a quote from the document. In every religious fact, when you take away the divine reality and the experience of it which the believer possesses, everything else, and especially the religious formulas of it, belongs to the sphere of phenomena and therefore falls under the control of science. Let the believer leave the world if he will, but so long as he remains in it, he must continue, whether we like it or not, to be subject to the laws, the observation, and the judgments of science and history. Okay? So we're finding here that this putting God in this box to explain the unknowable and not allowing him to be a separate source of knowledge but an equal source of knowledge, as St. Thomas did, it leads to this kind of primacy of science and history and a denial of what is known by faith. Okay? So, divine reality of God versus the idea of God. Okay? So there's a difference there's this divine reality of God which the believer believes, and then there's this idea of God which is a subject of philosophy. So this makes it subordinate to science, makes faith subordinate to science. So here's another quote. When it is said that God is the subject of faith alone, the statement refers only to the divine reality, not to the idea of God. The latter also is subject to science, which, while it philosophizes in what is called the logical order, soars also to the absolute and the ideal. Now, this idea of the ideal is that they believe that faith is the perfection of reason. This is how they get around the second source of knowledge. Faith is just the perfection of reason. So we have to be able to go to the perfect. We got to go to the ideal in our philosophizing. and therefore it's all, it doesn't make sense, because instead of just explaining things as a mystery where there's a conflict between science and faith, which is what we traditionally did as Catholics, it's a mystery. We have lots of mysteries. We talk about mysteries all the time. I talked about mysteries in this book. one of the things the character doesn't like is that the Catholic Church explains things as mysteries when it's hard to make sense of them. So instead of doing that, you now subordinate it all to science, okay? Now, the third part, the third objection here, ground for faith being subject to science, is that man will not tolerate a dualism. So if there's a conflict, the believer has to side with science, of course, right? So finally, this is a quote from the document, finally, man does not suffer a dualism to exist in him, and the believer therefore feels within him an impelling need to so harmonize faith and science that it may never oppose the general conception which science sets forth concerning the universe. So this is kind of on the believer, because the philosopher is smart enough to be having this double think go on in his head, where I'm talking to philosophers, I believe one thing, talking to believers, I believe something else. But if you're a believer, you don't really have that capacity. So you have to just confine your faith to what is unknowable. Okay? Again, this is this idea that faith transfigures and disfigures science, and science cannot affect faith, since faith only deals with the unknowable, which is outside the realm of science. Okay. Now, let's hear a couple of quotes from the document about what how Pius X objects to this stuff. Okay? Quote number 1. All this, venerable brothers, is in formal opposition with the teachings of our predecessor, Pope Pius IX, where he lays it down that in matters of religion it is the duty of philosophy not to command but to serve, not to prescribe what is to be believed, but to embrace what is to be believed with reasonable obedience, not to scrutinize the depths of the mysteries of God, but to venerate them devoutly and humbly. Okay? There we have the point about respecting the mysteries. Okay? Quote number 2. The modernists completely invert the parts, and to them may be applied the words of another predecessor of ours, Gregory IX, addressed to some theologians of his time. Some among you, inflated like bladders with the spirit of vanity, strive by profane novelties to cross the boundaries fixed by the fathers, twisting the sense of the heavenly pages to the philosophical teaching of the rationals, not for the profit of their hearer, but to make a show of science. These, seduced by strange and eccentric doctrines, make the head of the tail and force the queen to serve the servant. Okay, so you can see this is the battle that was going on prior to Vatican II. Where are we now? We're off in this land where, things happen we can't really understand and reconcile with our faith from previous times. Again, my name is Joseph Soa Jr. This is The Smoke of Satan, where we're talking about the papal encyclical, Pascendi Dominici Gregis, from Saint Pius X. And this is episode 4 on the Modernist As Believer, and now in our next episode, part 5, we will talk about the methods of the modernists and the modernist theologian. Okay? So, thank you very much. Again, my book here is When the Wood is Dry, edgy Catholic thriller, my comic book and graphic novel by Prophet, and my Christmas book, Merry Friggin' Christmas, an edgy Christmas comedy, which comes in a naughty and a standard edition. Thank you very much.